Okay, like Melissa mentioned, this is our third session of our community of practice of the resilience factor. The next section in the book talks about mastering those 7 skills for you to improve your resilience. So the author has grouped those 7 skills of resilience into 2 categories: know thyself and change skills. So today, in our session, we're going to go over 2 of those know thyself skills. We're going to go over learning your ABCs and avoid thinking traps. The know thyself skills give you a map of your beliefs, your feelings, and behaviors, and how they are interconnected. It is how you see yourself in the world and why you react to events the way that you do. So starting with learning your ABCs. Learning your ABCs, it equips you with the skills to detect your thoughts when you're in the middle of adversity and to understand the emotional impact of those beliefs. That your emotions and beliefs are triggered not by the event itself, but how we interpret what happened. So our beliefs cause our feelings and behaviors. So the first step in the ABC skill is to identify the adversities that challenge your resilience. So those times when adversities rob us of our grace, those push button adversities, everyone has adversities that just push your buttons. So if you've not already done so, in the book on page 68 was a list of which adversities push your buttons. You rate them on a scale of 1 being not at all difficult to a 5, which is extremely difficult. So let's take a couple of minutes so everyone can take a look at this list of adversities and rate yourself on those adversities listed. Some of y'all may have already done so as you read the book, and some of y'all may not have your book with you, but everything that's on the slide is exactly what was in the book. But if you do have your book, it is on page 68.
How about if we use the raise hand function just so that we have a good idea of when everyone has had a chance to rate those. So if you've had a chance to rate those, we'll use the raise hand function to gauge that.
I think, Maggie, we've just about got everybody. Okay. So in those situations where you scored 4s or 5s, it's an adversity for you. So when you're taking a look at your list of those that were adversities for you, do they share a common feature or a common theme? I can't remember, Maggie, were we going to have people just chat, or were we?
Yeah, I think it's fine just if you're comfortable putting it in the chat box. If you want to come off of mute and share, if you're comfortable. Like, I know that these are potentially pretty personal responses.
Yeah, but do you see that you have a common theme or a common feature in the ones that you scored 4 or 5? Don't like conflict. I'm with you on that one. I can relate definitely to that one. All right. Well, conflict for me too. Yeah. Don't like, feel like, yeah.
Kelly, I feel you on that one. That was one of
Yeah.
my highest ones also.
And then that just leads into the, sadness, frustration, shame. I think shame is one of the most intense negative emotions.
Yeah, agree. Well, thank you all for your responses. Moving to the next slide. As we mentioned earlier, beliefs or thoughts about an event drive how we feel and what we do. So in the moment, those uncensored ticker tape beliefs are the thoughts that run through your mind that determine how you feel and what you decide to do in that moment of adversity. So there are two categories of ticker tape beliefs, those why beliefs or causal beliefs, and the what next, those implication beliefs. So why did this happen? You want to understand what caused the problem. People tend to answer the why questions the same way over and over. As you listen to your why beliefs, start looking for patterns. The better you are at identifying and labeling your why beliefs, it makes it easier for you to change them when they interfere with your ability to respond to adversity. The what's going to happen next, many of us experience what next beliefs that are catastrophic and highly improbable. Sometimes this causes, it creates anxiety. It works against your problem-solving efforts and it undermines your resilience. So sometimes those beliefs, those ticker tape beliefs, are neither why beliefs or what next, but for the most part, they have you have a dominant style. They either focus on the cause of the problem or on the implications of the event. For now, it's important that you listen to your ticker tape and you're aware of your pattern. Why are you more why focused or what next focused? So the next thing we're going to do is have breakout groups, and we're going to talk or discuss what are those push button adversities in your life, and do you tend to be why focused or what next focused? So we'll give you 10 minutes for these breakout rooms. And Melissa, are you the one sending them out? Let's see here.
Yeah, I've got those created for us. So we'll open the rooms now.
All right, I believe we have everybody back. I hope that you all had some meaningful conversations. Is there anybody who would feel comfortable sharing any insights or things that stood out to you from your conversation with colleagues in the breakout rooms?
I think one thing that we discovered early on when we were reviewing that little chart was that, I'm sorry, I'm not on video. It's not working.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
One thing we kind of said is our answers would have been different at different times in our life. Like I was trying to think like 15 years ago when I had a 6-year-old and a 1-year-old, oh my gosh, my answers, I know what 5s I would have had then as to what 5s I have now. So even if we're like continuing to do this or something, it could be something that we could review like yearly or something, just to be aware, be self-aware of what's changing in us and what affects us now.
That's a really great idea, really great insight. I hadn't thought about, the different stages in my life, but I suspect that you're right, that if we were to return to this at a different phase, those push button adversities might look different. Thank you so much, Sally, for sharing.
You're
Is
welcome.
anyone else comfortable sharing something that was discussed or shared in their group?
I'll just say we talked the last one also about those quizzes being very point in time, right? Like, this is who I am today. I'm probably going to be somebody different even at 6 p.m. tonight, you know? So, you know, we grow and we change, and that's such a great thing to recognize, because we can, I don't know, sometimes I feel like, you know, cut ourselves some slack is always a good thing, but recognizing that we've got different buttons at different times. So.
Absolutely. What about, did anybody get a chance to talk about whether you were kind of why focused or what next focused? One thing I love that they pointed out in the book, you know, people who tend to be why focused look back and look for the causes, you know, like they said, those causal, you know, instances, and then the what next, people are looking forward, like, okay, what are the implications of this? And I'm noticing after reading and reviewing the content that I tend to be very much one over the other. And I'm curious if any of you all have noticed that as well.
In our group, we talked about we were both what next, because we're I'm a control person. So I think if I go to the worst thing that can happen and make a plan for that, then anything else that happens, it might be not so bad. And so I have a plan. So
Thank you. I'm guessing there are some what next folks in our group who can probably relate to that statement.
In our group, 2 of us said we were what next, and one said maybe a little bit of both. And I think
Okay.
we all find a little bit of both in ourselves from time to time.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, and that's actually a great segue into the next segment. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing again, and we're going to start talking about the consequences. And I will say now that I've shared with Teresa as we were planning for this, I do not like the fact that they call this consequences, because I don't necessarily think that your feelings or behaviors should be labeled as consequences, because they might not be so bad. But I also totally get the fact that they wanted like ABC congruency. Like I like that too. So anyway, all right, let's move on. Sorry, personal pet peeve there. Not a push button adversity, just a pet peeve. All right, so consequences as defined by the book are the feelings and beliefs that are the result of the adversities that we experience. So when we're talking, oops, sorry about that, guys. Move that the other way. When we're talking about resiliency, you know, resilient people are able to regulate their emotions and control their emotions, control their reactions so that they can respond appropriately in a situation that arises. You know, the goal is to have your emotions and behaviors be productive, have them be appropriate for the situation, and not this knee-jerk reaction. So these are what we call the BC connections, and they are very common consequences or feelings that are the result of some of those beliefs when you do your ticker tape beliefs. So I'm going to actually kind of touch on each one of the 5 a little, you know, pretty briefly. And the reason that I kind of asked when we were discussing if you are why focused or what next focused is that there are some of these that the authors claim that if you are a why focused individual, generally speaking, then you will experience some of these emotions more than others. And if you are a what next thinking individual, there are some of these that you may experience over some others. So when we're talking about violation of your rights leading to anger, you know, that basically is rooted in the feeling that another person has caused you harm and believing that they could have chosen otherwise. That most frequently leads to feelings of anger. And, you know, it answers the question, why did this happen to me? So when we're talking about a why versus a what next belief, this one is very why rooted. And then one thing that I found really interesting when I was studying the book is that the authors always point out a way that this consequence, this feeling can be beneficial. And, so for this situation, the violation of your rights, anger is beneficial because it helps us be in tune or aware when there is the danger of harm. The next one is the real world loss or loss of self-worth. And that leads to sadness or depression. This one is also a why rooted belief. And the kind of benefit or positive side that sadness brings is that it causes us to look internally and kind of be introspective. And so we will look for ways to improve ourselves or look for ways to prevent sadness in the future. Also, one of the things that the book pointed out that I thought was a really good point is that sadness, situational sadness, brings your tribe to you. It's an emotion that causes your loved ones to kind of surround you and help protect you and support you through those times of sadness. The violation of another's rights leads to guilt. And this is, someone had mentioned shame as we came out of our breakout group. This is the portion of the book that talks about shame, because guilt in extremes is where you find individuals who are experiencing shame. Guilt can be a healthy emotion. It means that we have not lived up to what we were expecting of ourselves. The language the book uses is it's breaches in self-regulation or breaches in commitments that most often cause guilt. Betty, do you have a comment you want to add?
Yeah, I didn't know if this was a good time to say it, but on page 80, the author talks about guilt's cousin being named shame. And that really popped for me. I can be a very guilt prone person at times. So I have to really watch that. So I thought that was very impactful, the way they wrote that. So
yes. And I love the fact that they call shame toxic and guilt can be a positive emotion. Guilt drives us to change. If I feel guilty because I've made a commitment and not lived up to my end, that's going to hopefully guide me to a place where I'm going to hold that commitment next time. But if you're living in shame, it doesn't have that same positive impact on the way you feel control to change your life. So I thought that was, a really, really good section when it talks about the positive impact of guilt versus the toxicity of shame in our lives. The next one, future threat leads to anxiety and fear. This one, it talks about how it's most common. Anxiety and fear are most common in what next people because they're constantly aware. Their thoughts focus on the potential threat or potential danger. Anxiety and fear can be positive because you are aware of your surroundings. You are most often looking for safer territory. I love that language that the book used. However, anxiety and fear can affect every single part of our bodies physiologically. And so one of the points that is made and kind of driven home in this section of the book is that it's important for us to recognize and capture the thoughts when we see that they are triggering anxiety. Because we don't want it to become debilitating. And there's a whole portion later in the book that talks about, when that anxiety gets a little out of control in our lives. The last one is, negative comparison to others leads to embarrassment. So I found this really interesting in the book because it talks about embarrassment as the feeling that you experience when your behavior or your actions are inconsistent with your personal standards. And, I'd never heard it that's such an eloquent way. I'm embarrassed when I trip and fall in the grocery store, but my personal standard is that I can walk. Like I can put one foot in front of the other, pushing a grocery cart, or, and so I'm probably going to cling to that language a little bit because I'm a very clumsy person. So my personal standards are higher than my physical abilities sometimes. And that's how I'm going to live my life, is understanding that that's just a personal standard that maybe I haven't lived up to. Embarrassment's also sometimes rooted in social comparison. So someone who is comparing themselves with others might have a higher tendency to feel embarrassed than someone who doesn't compare themselves to others frequently. And this one, another piece that I wanted to share that I found very impactful is that individuals who are in their moment of embarrassment live in a place or are experiencing a place where they feel like they've lost standing in front of people whose opinions they value. So if you are with people who you value their opinion, it matters to you what they think of you, it matters to you how they feel about you, then you are at a higher risk for embarrassment, is kind of how I understood that. But negative comparison to others leads to the feelings of embarrassment. So those are kind of the 5 BC connections. The most common consequences, feelings that are experienced in, those 5 beliefs. So I just wanted to point those out, and then we're going to talk about how to use them. So the book talks about 2 different ways to use our knowledge of these BC connections. One of them is detangling your emotions, and the other is identifying beliefs that have trapped you. So when we're talking about detangling your emotions, we're clarifying things. So often we can get caught up in the moment, and a situation causes us to feel a certain way. Those feelings lead us to act a certain way, and we could spend just exuberant amounts of time then trying to go back and repair that situation that was caused by our feelings and our behaviors. And I want to point out, I have the chat open. There is a very good comment about one of Brene Brown's books that talks about guilt and shame. And just before we got too far away from that, I wanted to bring your attention to that. So if you're looking for a good summer reading book. Okay, so again, when we're talking about detangling your emotions, it's about taking the time to clarify what we're feeling, why we're feeling that way, so that we don't respond in a way that makes a situation worse, so that we don't respond in a way that, that escalates the emotions that are, bubbling under the surface there, so that we can navigate a conflict or an adversity more effectively, and boosting our resilience through that adversity. And then identifying the beliefs that have trapped you. This one is about bias. It's about how you interpret those events. It's about how you, how your tendency to read a situation may prevent you from seeing the facts of what has actually happened. So when we have biased thinking styles, we can be less effective in what we do, less happy. And so we really want to be able to give those a name, kind of identify them, so that we can recognize those biases in our thinking when they happen. On page 88, the authors talk about keeping an emotions log. This is just one of the strategies to use when you're detangling your emotions or when you're identifying the beliefs that have trapped you. I am a journaler, so I love this idea of keeping an emotions log. I also have seen some really cool like bullet journal layouts where you can use different colors when you have, different moods or different feelings that you experience throughout the day. There are some really interesting ways to track your emotions either throughout the day or throughout a week or throughout a month. But this is a good way to give you evidence to be able to, again, just give a name to your feelings and behaviors in response to adversities that you encounter. I am a big believer in that sometimes when I look in hindsight at a situation, how I think I felt about it after the fact or how I think I responded to it after the fact may not be accurate. And I don't think I'm the only one who has a tendency to look at my own reactions with some rose-colored glasses sometimes. So I love the thought of this emotions log in the moment because I think it will be much more real. In terms of how we felt and how we reacted to a situation. And again, the description of that process is on page 88. Okay, so now that we kind of have all the background and all the information on the ABCs, the book breaks down the steps in how to use these in our lives to build resiliency. So it's very simple. They're on the screen. Not going to go into a whole lot of detail. But the first step is to describe the adversity, like describe what's happened to you. The second step is to identify the emotions and behaviors in your reaction. So if you notice, that's the A and the C. Those are the first two steps, is identify what happened, identify how you felt about it and what you did. Then you try to connect those with the beliefs that made you feel that way or made you act that way. Then you're going to check your logic. So if your belief is that someone cut you off in traffic because they don't respect you because, I was going to say woman driver, but I don't think we're all women in the room anymore. But we're just going to go with it. Okay, someone cut me off in traffic because I'm a woman and they don't respect me, and that's why they cut me off. But if I identify let's say I identify my emotion as depression, well, that doesn't match up. The matching emotion would be anger, because it would be a violation of my rights. So that's why it's saying check your logic using the BC connections to help you give your emotions names that logically match up with your internal beliefs that may have been caused by the adversity. So it's a little bit of working backwards, but I think that chart of BC connections, which I will mention, it's on page 75 in your books. But checking it against the logic in that chart is helpful if things start to feel a little muddled, and you're trying to give those emotions names. And then cross-check. So if you did experience, in the situation that I described, someone cut you off in traffic, if you experienced sadness from that, then maybe you also experienced anger, but sadness would be due to some kind of a loss. Maybe a loss of, honestly, I do feel like it's a loss when somebody doesn't feel like they have, enough respect to follow the rules of the road or whatever. I don't know. But they should be coupled. So if you have multiple emotions, you might have multiple beliefs that are tied to that adversity. All right. So we are going to give this a shot. We have developed a Google form that matches the practice ABC worksheet on page 90. I am going to share a link to a Google sheet, and in your breakout groups, you are going to come up with an adversity, and it can be hypothetical. If you're comfortable sharing a personal adversity that you have dealt with and you want to work through that, you can. I'm going to read through the instructions, share the screen so you can see it. We've actually developed a sample for you. And then we'll let you work through one on your own. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is I'm going to provide the chat to the Google Sheet. And actually, let me do that because you all can be looking at it while I read through the instructions. I'm so sorry. Please bear with me. Okay, the link is now in chat. So when you open it up, you're going to see that there are 4 columns, and we have an adversity column, a belief column, a belief category column, that's from that BC Connections chart, and then a consequence column. And what we're going to do in our breakout groups is you're going to type up an adversity. Again, this can be real or made up depending on your comfort level in sharing. Then you're going to jump down to column D and identify the feeling or the behavior that was caused by that adversity. And then you're going to kind of work backwards and identify the beliefs that may have caused those feelings. And this is, you know, when Teresa said those authentic kind of nitty-gritty feelings, even if they are unfounded, even if they are illogical, they're still your beliefs. So it's important to give them a name. And then we're going to identify the belief category. Now, the example that I've provided is a very real example from my days as a coordinator. So I'm going to share screen. I know that a lot of you have been able to successfully access the document. So that makes me feel good. Okay. Okay. So the adversity that we came up with as an example is my principal left my center name off of the flyer for an upcoming family night, even though I'm providing materials for different activities and my center is providing the meal. So my resulting feeling from that was sadness. And because I felt unappreciated and undervalued, I stopped contributing time and energy and resources above the minimum required. One possible belief that caused me to feel that way is that my principal doesn't value the work that I'm doing. She doesn't want other people to see me as a contributor or a leader. And then the belief category that fits in is a loss of self-worth. So that's the example. What we're going to do now is you're going to go back to your breakout groups. So you're not doing this on your own. You can bounce ideas off of colleagues from your breakout groups. And if you will just choose a row, 1 row per group. So if someone else is typing in a box, just hop down to the next one. And the box should expand when you hit enter. So just so everybody knows, the form is set up so where it will wrap your text. If you type out what's in there and then, you know, tab to the next box or enter to solidify it, it should adjust your box size so that we'll be able to read it. But if you will come up with a sample adversity, the potential feelings, the consequences that it would cause, and then identify the potential beliefs and pick the belief category that it fits in. Are there any questions about the activity that we're going to do and kind of practice this ABC process? Okay. We had talked about allowing up to 15 minutes for this. We're gonna give you 15 minutes, and then if there is a group that needs more time, or if you all get done with it pretty quickly and want to come back early, we'll kind of keep an eye on the sheet to how everyone is progressing through the activity. Does that sound good?
Can you go over the belief categories one more time? There was
Yes.
a question in the chat for that.
So if you have your books, the belief categories are on page 75. But if you do not have your books, let me see if I can. I'm going to try to put them up on my screen. I'm going to go back to sharing the PowerPoint really quickly so that you can see those. A belief that your rights have been violated often leads to anger. Belief that you have experienced a real world loss or a loss of self self-worth leads to sadness and depression. A violation of someone else's rights leads to guilt. A future threat leads to anxiety or fear, and a negative comparison to other leads to embarrassment. And I will say, you all, that in the example that I came up with, I could have put sadness, I could have put anger, I could have put embarrassment. And I believe that there are potentially multiple different feelings, multiple different consequences that can be tied to each adversity that we face. We are not asking you to map out all of those feelings for your one example. It's perfectly fine if you just want to identify one and then track that back. Again, we're just practicing the skill. Thank you for pointing that out. I had not seen that in chat yet.
So we've got 15 minutes on the breakout rooms. So we're going to open up the rooms. And I think there are a couple people that came in after we did the first one. So I'll add you in. So if you don't get an assignment immediately, just hang on. I'll get them in there.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
It's being recorded.
Yes. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for your participation. Welcome back. I'm going to take us to the Google Sheet so that we can talk about some of the responses. I think that you all have been very perceptive in your responses. There were a lot of good thoughts. It seems to me like we have a pretty good handle on this ABC process. So the very first one here, teachers don't want to participate in events that causes us to feel sadness and frustration. I know I need to have programs, but I can't get others on board. Okay, those are very relatable feelings to that experience of teachers not wanting to participate in your programs. One of the potential beliefs, they don't want me to be a part of their team. They don't value me as a part of their team. And so that category fits into the real world loss because those students don't have access to the information and the resources that you have to provide, but also a loss of self-worth. So it looks to me, I don't know whose group that was, but I noticed that was a very kind of a clear cut. I think we could take that frustration piece and tie it back to anger as well, because you have a responsibility to do programming. You have like that can feel like a violation of rights because you are, you're a professional, you're an educator, you have a job to do. And if that, if that's being violated, that can lead to anger. And I think that frustration is one of those anger related feelings. So that could be broken down as well. But again, I mentioned that a lot of these could cause a lot of additional feelings, probably than just one. One that I wanted to point out, this on row 9. And the only reason why I want to mention this is because I want us to be very clear in what our adversities are. Adversities are experiences. This statement, the district contact is not supportive. What I would ask, kind of following up with this response, is what did the district contact say or do, or what did the district contact not say or not do that led you to believe that they are not supportive? To me, what's in this box here is more of a belief. That's what you believe about the district contact. It's not a specific adversity that was experienced. Does that make sense? So I think that, the resulting consequences, those feelings, the sadness, depression, anger, embarrassment, I think that those are very closely tied to those beliefs. And in order to believe that, I tend to believe that there are probably lots of adversities that have occurred that all have formulated this belief. This belief is rooted in a pattern of behavior, perhaps by this individual. So I just wanted to point out that I think that box is more descriptive of a belief than a specific adversity. And then I would like to point out number 10, the possibility that legislators may vote to change FRYSC. the resulting consequences. We do what we can do to change the minds of decision makers. We don't sit in anxiety and fear. We took action, controlled what we could. So those are the feeling, the emotion is identified there as anxiety or fear, and the behavior was a very resilient one. I just want to point out that this is why I'm not sure I like the word consequence, because when we recognize that there is a future threat, that belief category that this group identified, they responded in a very effective, proactive way. They took action. We communicated with our legislators and decision makers. So I wanted to point that one out as well. But I think overall, as a group, you all are very well versed in recognizing the emotions that you experience and tying those into those kind of deep-seated beliefs that may exist. Okay, I'm going to switch back to our PowerPoint. Okay, so just a quick recap of the ABCs. I feel like these are some processes that most of us are probably already doing, but now we kind of have a name for it. So we can identify adversities. Maybe there are some that we respond to better than others. So even if we are kind of experts in one area, we may still have a room to grow in another, but you can recognize your in the moment beliefs. You can identify how those beliefs make you feel and make you act. This is something that can be practiced every day. And one point that the book makes that I think is really valuable is that when you are getting ready to enter a situation that has the potential to be a push button adversity for you, you know, one of my greatest adversities that I identified in that little self-assessment was conflict with family. I do not enjoy conflict with family. So if I'm going into a situation where I know there's the potential for conflict with family, you can actually be proactive and start thinking ahead of time. What are some of my beliefs? What are some of the ways I might be made to feel? What are some of the ways I might act or not want to act? And that can make you a more efficient, proactive, person. So that's kind of a recap of the ABCs, and I'm going to turn it back over to Teresa, who's going to talk to us about the thinking traps.
All right. So the author talked about 8 different common thinking traps that we may find ourselves, that we may fall into. So one of the first ones that they mentioned was jumping to conclusions. So those are the times that we make assumptions without relative data. So people who habitually jump to conclusions, they respond impulsively to situations because they act before they have the full information, before they know everything about what's going on. Tunnel vision, it's most often directed toward negative outcomes. You see only the negative aspects of a situation. Magnifying and minimizing, you overvalue some and then you're undervaluing others. For example, if you magnify all of the negatives and then you're minimizing all of the positives, or vice versa. Personalizing, that means that you tend to, the reflex is for you to attribute problems to things about yourself. And then the other thinking traps are externalizing, which is kind of the opposite of personalizing. You are not able to figure out the elements of the adversity that is of their doing, but and within their control. Overgeneralizing, it's when you make overgeneralizations based on self. You're saying everything is explained based on your flawed characteristics. You're attributing causes of the problem to others' character rather than their behaviors. In mind reading, you believe it's the belief that we know what those around us are thinking, and we act accordingly. We tend to jump to conclusions, Also, if you're sometimes mind readers expect others to know exactly what you're thinking. And emotional reasoning is you're drawing conclusions about the nature of the world based on your emotional state at that time. So we're going to go back into our breakout groups. And while you're there, you want to be discussing those thinking traps that you recognize and that you see yourself falling into. So of those 8 that were mentioned in the book, what are some of those thinking traps that you recognize in yourself and then you see yourself fall into?
How long in this group, Teresa?
Do you want to do the 10 minutes, Maggie, or do we need to shorten the time? Do you want?
We are at 11:20 right now, so I feel like maybe 7-8 minutes would be plenty.
Yeah, 7 minutes. That's what I was thinking too.
Perfect.
All righty. Opening the rooms.
Those common thinking traps with your groups. Were there any insights or questions or comments that you all would like to share with the rest of the group or pose to the rest of the group? Feel free to come off of mute if you have something that you would like to share out.
Well, I know that we talked about how all of them could really apply. So our group was the teachers in my school do not want to participate in events.
You all worked ahead. I was watching that Google sheet.
So what we talked about, one of the bigger things we talked about was tunnel vision. Sometimes my teachers can only see what's in their 4 walls and they don't really see what's going on in the whole building or in the district, because right now they're focused on what's happening in their classroom, which is what they should be focused on. But that doesn't make anything any easier, right? Like for me to get them to do events, it doesn't help. So
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's very perceptive to recognize that, especially this time of year. Like if you happen to still be in session and your teachers are trying to get wrapped up for the year and they've got this award ceremony and that choir concert and like all these disruptions, then I think we can be very sensitive or empathize with how they might be feeling and trying to get everything in. But yes, I think that tunnel vision is something that others might be experiencing right now in this season. Any other thoughts or comments? Carol, I noticed you came off of mute. Was that on purpose or on accident? Do you know you're not muted right now? if not, you're welcome. Yeah. All right, any other just insightful things? If you happen to recognize some of these thinking traps that you fall into most frequently.
Well, I feel like, and this is just, and I was saying that as we went off, but I think that at one point, and as she was describing those to begin with, I was feeling each one of them. And I know that at some point in my career, I have been in those areas. And I hope that I have worked kind of through them, but I can see me falling back into some of them. But at the same time, because I have been those, I can identify those with those around me in the school too. I can tell you which teachers are quick to judge or quick to jump into something or quick to have that tunnel. I might as well not tell her because she's not going to get it. I mean, they're right here, focused right here, and they don't care what's going on around here. And I mean, I just, that's just my personal viewpoint of, I'm going personal, ain't it?
That's okay. You are in a safe space.
Yeah, well, and I just feel like that everybody jumps in and out of those things too. And I just don't know that until those kind of things are identified, if they would ever know it enough to work towards getting out of it. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that it requires like personal work, personal choice. Like I want to climb out of this, or I want to prevent this thinking trap. That's definitely a required first step. There was a good comment in chat that I would like to share from Brittany. She comments they're fluid. It's not like they're one and done. It's good to remember that not only do we have those traps, but we are working with others who are suffering from their own traps. And it's easy for people to not even realize that they are caught in a thinking trap. I think that that is a very insightful comment. I noticed as I was reading this chapter, and I know we talk a lot about how it's very situational in this group, and a lot of the things that we talk about, you know, I find myself falling into the thinking trap of mind reading with my husband, but I don't necessarily fall into that trap when I'm working with Teresa, or when I'm working with Betty, or when I'm working with Melissa. You know, it's very situational. You know, I know one of my greatest thinking traps is personalizing, and I love the fact that now I've read that and I can give it a name. So hopefully, you know, at least in my personal life, I can make steps toward not just climbing out of that trap, but preventing falling into it in the first place. But I do think that it's very situational, and that in different professional relationships and different personal relationships, depending on what the situation is, how intense of a push button adversity it is, because something else I recognize, you all, like, the more intense the adversity, the easier it is to fall into some of these traps. And that's not a good inverse relationship to have. So we have to be even more aware when we find ourselves in a very intense, hard, personally hard push button adversity. Thank you all for sharing those thoughts and those comments. I find that the conversations that happen through these communities of practice are so useful and so beneficial in processing, you know, the content that's in the book. There is, all right, I'm up next, aren't I? Teresa, is it my turn? Okay. We should be back on the PowerPoint. So there is a very practical way to use this skill of avoiding thinking traps in your life. And most of the skills that we're going to talk about for the rest of the community practice are all based on that ABCs. So just like a lot of the skills we're going to talk about over the next month, the very first step in using the avoiding thinking trap skill is breaking down that situation into identifying the adversity, identifying the consequence and the related belief. The next step then is to check that belief against the list of thinking traps. So, you know, whatever underlying assumption or underlying generalization that you have that has caused that belief, use that with this list of thinking traps to identify which thinking trap it is. Then you ask yourself simple questions. And I like these simple questions, and I'm getting ready to share them with you, but they are a very fact-driven way to climb out of a thinking trap or to prevent the thinking trap from happening. And then the last step is to hold yourself back from inaccurate assumptions that prevent being resilient. But we're going to look at those simple questions next. So if you are guilty of committing the thinking trap or falling into the thinking trap of jumping to conclusions, the goal in that situation is to slow yourself down, slow your roll. And the way that you do that is by asking the simple question, what evidence have you based your conclusion on? And are you certain or are you guessing? The next one with tunnel vision, if you find yourself in a situation where you have fallen into the thinking trap of tunnel vision, the goal is to refocus on the big picture. And the simple questions are, what is a fair assessment of this entire situation? What is the big picture? How important is this one aspect of the big picture? The next one, if you are guilty of overgeneralizing, you want to look closely at the behaviors involved. Is there a narrower explanation than the one I've assumed to be true? Is there a specific behavior that explains the situation? What does impugning my or someone else's character by me? And is it logical to indict my or another's character based or worth based on this event? If you are finding yourself in the thinking trap of magnifying or minimizing, the goal is to strive for balance. Were there any good things that happened? Did I do anything well? Or am I overlooking any problems, or were there any negative elements that I'm dismissing? So this one, if you're guilty of magnifying, those first two questions will help pull you out of that thinking trap. And if you are guilty of minimizing, those last two questions will help kind of pull you out of that thinking trap. For the thinking trap of personalizing, the goal is to learn to look outward. Then anyone else contribute to this situation? How much of the problem is due to me and how much is due to others? For externalizing, the goal is to hold yourself accountable and identify what you did to contribute to the situation and how much of the problem is due to others and how much is due to me. If you are finding yourself in mind reading, the goal is to speak up and ask questions. Did I make my beliefs and feelings known directly and clearly? Did I convey all of the pertinent information? Am I expecting the other person to work hard at figuring out my needs and goals? That kind of sounds like a game, doesn't it? Figure out my needs and goals. Good luck. All right. And then lastly, the thinking trap of emotional reasoning. The goal is to separate your feelings from the facts of the situation. The simple question, have there been times when my feelings didn't accurately reflect the facts of the situation? And what questions must I ask to know the facts? So those are the simple questions. They are actually found in your books on page 121. Page 121 goes through all 8 of the thinking traps and has these questions there for you. That is a page that I definitely recommend flagging in your book because it's very useful and very helpful. So we have one more little activity before we go our separate ways today. And that ABC's worksheet, while you all were in your last breakout groups, I expanded it a little bit because now we are going to identify the thinking trap and identify the simple questions that we can use. I don't think this is going to take much time at all. So one thing that I mentioned, Rebecca, when you were talking, I noticed that you mentioned the thinking trap that the teachers are in. I want us to focus on the thinking trap that we are in. When we're experiencing that sadness and frustration because the teachers won't give us time to implement programming, what thinking trap do we fall in for the purposes of this activity? So I'm going to share the link again for anyone who may need it. I'm going to drop that back into the chat box just so you have it easily accessible. And this part, we're just going to do, I really think 5 minutes is plenty of time, Melissa. So we're going to go to a breakout group for 5 minutes, and you're going to finish out the row that you started. So if you are looking at the sheet, you will notice that for our sample one, where the principal did not acknowledge the center's contributions to a family night, the thinking trap that we identified in the sample is jumping to conclusions because we are assuming that the reason she left it off is because she doesn't value the work that we're doing and doesn't want our colleagues to see us as a leader in the building. That was jumping to a conclusion. I think that it could also fall into others. So I'm not saying that there can't be more than one. I think there absolutely can. That's just one that I think fits well. And then the simple questions that we can use to climb out of that is, what evidence have we based the conclusion on? And are we certain or are we guessing? So I am going to, as long as I think we are ready, we're going to do 5 minutes in breakout groups just to finish out the last 2 columns of this worksheet where you identify the thinking trap and the simple questions. And again, those can be found on page let me look at it again, just so I know. Was it 121? Yes. Okay. Page 121, if you need a reference to kind of an overview of the thinking traps and the simple questions. Are there any questions about the activity or what we're going to do for the next 5 minutes? All right. If not, I believe we're ready. Thank you. If I shared correctly, you should see the Google Sheet that we've been working on. I think that jumping to conclusions is one that I noticed on all of them. And I think that is probably one of the most common thinking traps, which is probably why they listed it first. And in terms of the simple questions, I know not everybody took the time to type them out. They're all listed for you. So I don't think they needed to be just copied and pasted from our book into these boxes. The purpose of this activity was just to recognize how the thinking traps are tied to the ABCs, and how the process of asking these simple questions, it really helps us identify, yes, we're in a thinking trap, and very quickly can potentially give us the opportunity to climb out. Melissa, do you have something to add?
I do. I have a funny story about my mother and jumping to conclusions and going back to your somebody cut me off in traffic
Yeah.
example. So my mom, when she would come to visit here in Lexington, I do all the driving, and she gets so mad, would just get really mad about traffic. I mean, it's like to the point where she was like visibly angry. And I'm like, we're trying to have a nice time together. We're trying to, go have some lunch or whatever. And so I started telling her, I said, there's no reason to be mad, Mom, because I'm pretty sure that guy has a terrible case of diarrhea and he's just trying to get home. So we're going to jump to that conclusion so that we don't get mad. And now when it happens in traffic, we literally laugh about it just because that became like the joke, is reframing how it is. And I think that doing the ABCs and, putting it, down on paper is a fantastic practice to help you reframe that so that you can have a different reaction or learn a different skill, a way of dealing with something. And that's just a funny example.
I love that example. And the fact that it built on my earlier made up example is wonderful.
And I'm telling you, we must have terrible water here in Lexington because lots of people got diarrhea.
Yes.
And now that's recorded. So that's there for posterity.
I love it. It'll be preserved on YouTube forever and ever. No, I think that's a great strategy. I can remember when I was little and one of my parents would get very frustrated in traffic and the other one would always be like, we don't know if they're having a medical emergency. We don't know what, maybe they're on their way to the hospital to meet their first grandbaby or, just something, very empathetic to a situation of wanting to get somewhere very quickly. Not as fun or funny as needing to get home for that reason, but I think it's a great strategy. So really just in recapping these thinking traps, I think that we recognize them, especially when we read them in the book and read the descriptions. They are things that we all fall into from time to time. And hopefully with the strategy of being able to give it a name and just ask some simple questions, we will be able to prevent the number of times we fall into traps. And if we happen to fall into one, climb out of it very, very quickly. In closing out this chapter and this skill and this community of practice session, there are a couple of pages and there were things that Teresa and I didn't necessarily cover in the content, but does a really good job of recapping these thinking traps. And I'm actually going to read it directly to you because I think it is that meaningful of a passage. And it's found on the bottom of page 118. If you have your book, it says, the book had just talked about the process of induction thinking. And I thought it was really relevant, especially in the example that you all provided about district contacts not being supportive. We build how we see the world on a ton of specific little examples. little things happen to us, we recognize those patterns, and then we build generalizations from those things that happen repeatedly. And that's called an induction process of building our view of the world. And so that's what kind of this paragraph is recapping. This is what thinking traps are all about. Over time, using induction, we develop general rules about the world and about ourselves. When we jump to a conclusion, we're applying that rule to a new situation. When we personalize, we have a general rule of thumb about us that they themselves are generally to blame for a problem. Those who externalize, it's other people that cause them setbacks. Overgeneralizing is the trap we fall into when we take one of our rules and apply it where it doesn't belong. We continue to fall into these traps because generally induction is useful. And I think that's really important. You know, when we are working with students, when we're working with our kids, you know, I used to tell my kids all the time, like, you learn who people are and what their character is by a pattern of behavior. When you're making choices about who you want to surround yourself, we want them to be aware of these patterns. We want them to be aware of these things that happen. Building our worldview from induction is a very valuable process. I love that paragraph, and it goes on a little bit more, but I love how it identifies that this is a healthy process, but when we take it a little too far, or when we apply it to situations where it doesn't belong, that's when we can fall into the thinking traps. That was like a passage that I highlighted in one color, then drew on in another color and flagged with a flag. Like I thought it was really meaningful, because it's important to recognize that just because we fall into thinking traps doesn't mean that we don't have a healthy outlook on the world. It just means that we've over applied something that we've learned or that we've observed. So that is the skill of preventing thinking traps. I hope that this session has been meaningful to you. I hope that you will be able to apply the ABCs and avoiding thinking traps in your everyday life to become more resilient and more effective in the way that you handle adversity. And that is all we have. Melissa, I'm assuming there is a evaluation.
Don't have the evaluation done yet.
Okay.
There is I put the approval code in the chat for folks. You know, we're coming down to the wire, right? Don't you guys have to the end of the month to earn
May 30th.
earn hours, and then we have another month before you think I would know those things right off the top of my head, but I don't. I always have to look it up. So there's a couple of hours approval in there. I don't have the assessment or the feedback form completed just yet, so I will email it out to you folks that were here with us today to get your feedback on that. And as soon as the video is ready, we'll put it up on the training website. That's where they're all going. I can give you that link. There's actually a page now for this community of practice. Get it open here. And I'll put that in the chat. So if any of your colleagues say they wish they had gotten the information, you can share this link with them directly to the website. And we put the videos and the assessments there, but like I said, I'll email it to you guys who were here. So if you don't get that from me, like if I didn't get your name down on my list, email me and I'll send it to you if you don't hear from me in the next day or so with that link. So those are anonymous, and you don't have to do them to get credit. It's just feedback for us. So, you know, it's not a big deal if you don't get it, but we would appreciate the feedback. Always trying to get better.
Yes. All right. Any final thoughts, questions, comments, concerns? Thank you all so much for being a part of today. I really enjoyed spending my morning with you all. Thank you.
And our next one will be June 6th.
What are we covering on that one? What do we need to have read?
Chapter
great
6 and
question.
7.
6 and 7.
Yeah,
Thanks.
if you want to read that. The active, like today, the activities will be built around that. But if you haven't read it, don't feel like you can't come, right? So join us either way. But 6 and
Thanks.
7. Yeah.
The next
Thank
two
you all so
skills.
much.
Thank
Thanks, you guys.
you.
Have a great rest of your afternoon.
You too. Bye-bye.